I've been looking at lots of sales data over the last month or so, and it's kind of all leading up to this real big kind of 5-year deep dive into what manga sales versus comic book sales look like in the bookstore channel. Basically, when my channel began, kind of around 2018, going through 2022. I probably should have included the 2023 numbers, but I had just completed a video specifically on 2023. But in hindsight, I wish I had included it because there was an enormous change, at least when it comes to manga sales. You know, DC and Marvel actually somehow got worse, but the manga sales also got worse as well. It actually took a pretty steep decline. Instead of being 56% of the market, it actually comes down to more like 49% of the market. So there was a substantial decrease. And the highs that it ends up hitting in like 2022, which we'll get to, which is almost 30 million, drops down to more like 22 million. So that was a major change that will not be talked about as I gotta go through this deep dive. But as I kind of go through this deep dive, but certainly is observed. So manga is starting to come back down to earth, but it's already in such an enormous lead when it comes to comic book sales. Manga is still utterly destroying comic book when it comes to sales in the book channel. Another thing that's happened that we won't see in any of this stuff because it actually started happening in 2024, but it is making a big difference. DC has finally found a strategy for books that can compete with manga. It's their DC Compact Comics. I actually just talked about this a few weeks ago about just how popular they are and how they're really making an enormous impact on DC's bottom line. So in 2024, if we were to ever get those numbers from MPD Bookscan, which we won't, Brian Hibbs, the comic book retailer that actually compiles all this data, no longer has access to that information. You would see an enormous increase as far as competitive from DC Comics. Marvel has their own version of Compact Comics, but for some reason, nobody knows about it, and it's not making any impact really for Marvel Comics whatsoever. So those are two of the major trends that have changed outside of this kind of 5-year deep dive as we kind of look at the way that manga just kind of became this enormous tidal wave and overtook the American comic book market when it came to sales. I'm going to look at this a few different ways and kind of explain what you see here. I'm going to look at it through the financial numbers, the dollar sales in the US market, in the bookstore chains. I'm going to look at it unit sales, which tells an even more bleak story. Then we're going to talk about some of the top sellers and what they're moving. And then another trend that I think is very, very important to really understand why manga has pulled so far ahead and is continuing to stay ahead. Even if they came back a little bit, they are still well ahead of DC, Marvel, and basically the entire, what I call American comic book industry, which is traditional like superhero publishers, Marvel, DC, Image Comics. Dark Horse does do pretty good, but that's because they released Berserk. So they have some manga of their own. Now to get started, we will look at this from a dollars and cents perspective. The financial gap between manga and traditional American comic books isn't just wide, it's a canyon at this point, and it's been growing rapidly. Back in 2018, manga sales in the US were around $100 million, a strong showing, but still part of a broader graphic novel market dominated by Western publishers, in that case, mostly like Scholastic and YA graphic novels. Fast forward to 2022, and manga sales had surged to an astounding $438 million only in 5 years. It increased essentially 4.4 times in a 5-year span, which is absolutely enormous. By comparison, DC Comics, once the market leader, brought in only about $43 million. Marvel's situation was even more dire. They had just a single title crack the top 750 bestsellers, suggesting their total bookstore revenue is likely even lower than DC's. Manga didn't just catch up, it left American comics choking in its dust. And that's where the harder things, when you start going into these numbers that obviously Brian Hibbs have put a lot of work into, and that's why I really wanted to go back in there and look at all of it. It took quite a while to actually come up with this stuff. Marvel's almost completely not present. Like, you almost barely see that they even exist in the bookstore channel because they acknowledge the amount of SKUs that they put out, but they don't tell you the actual sales figures unless they crack like the top 750. And in Marvel's case, they had one book in 2022 do that. Thankfully, DC had a few more to show that they're still much further ahead than Marvel Comics when it comes to graphic novel sales. But they just are so far behind not only manga, but certainly Scholastic and other publishers like that. But manga certainly has a lot of superhero stories. They certainly have a different way of telling those stories. It's a different format, but there are a lot of similarities. And for some reason, DC and Marvel just are having a very hard time kind of catching up. Although at least, admittedly, as I mentioned before, DC took some measures to try and catch up, introduce these DC compact comics, but they are older comic books, mostly published like at least 30 years ago, just shrunk down to like the tankobon format size that a lot of people are used to reading with, especially younger readers. And it is making an impact, but it's not making up like $400 million worth of impact. It's not really closing the gap kind of like that, which is absolutely astounding. Because I remember when I started the channel, we're like, hey, noticing these manga sales are getting pretty big, and oh, they're still outpacing Marvel and DC. Marvel and DC are still falling behind, and then you get to the pandemic shutdown, and it felt like manga had everything people were looking for, and they were just kind of ignoring Marvel and DC, and they weren't able to take advantage of that moment in time to really grab an enormous market share, and it feels like manga just kind of ate it all up. Now, when you look at it from a unit sales perspective, it starts to look far worse, because typically a manga tankobon is going to cost about $10 just for one unit, whereas a DC or Marvel graphic novel, if it's just a normal trade, it's going to be $20 to $25. But then there's also a lot of really big collected editions that might be upwards of like $150 or $200. So manga is much, much cheaper. And when you start digging into the disparity, like at a units number, it gets real depressing. When it comes to sheer volume of books sold, manga's dominance becomes even more obvious. In 2018, manga moved roughly 10.8 million units. Not bad, but certainly not unbeatable at the time. But by 2021, that number had nearly tripled to 27.7 million, and it climbed again to 29.6 million units in 2022. That accounted for an absurd 56% of all graphic novels sold in North America. Meanwhile, DC managed just 1.5 million units across thousands of titles in that same year. Marvel's total isn't published, but with virtually no presence on the top-selling list, it's safe to assume it's far, far lower. For comparison, Viz Media alone, just one manga publisher in North America, sold 17.8 million units in 2022, absolutely dwarfing DC's number by more than 10 to 1. That's not a small gap, that is an absolute landslide. And once you start looking at it on the unit basis, it gets real bleak, as you can see that cheaper price point has really attracted a lot of people. And a lot of people obviously notice that different price point and have gone the manga route, where they're just absolutely destroying sales by unit. And the worst part is, if you look at worldwide numbers, DC, outside of North America, they sell a few more comic books than they do in North America. So they still do some decent sales outside of North America. But when you look at manga, Japan is the largest comic book market in the world. It actually is substantially larger than North America, even though it's so much smaller and has a lot fewer people within Japan. They have so many more people that are comic book readers basically on a daily basis, that their market there is exceptionally large, and it's almost all manga. So not only is manga dominating North America and making all that money that's dwarfing Marvel and DC, they're making substantially more than that just in Japan. And manga really has started taking over really worldwide. South America, even some place like the Philippines, which has an enormous history with American comic books, it's all dominated here by manga. And we've seen that trend basically go worldwide. And, Marvel and DC might say, hey, comic books are small potatoes. There ain't a whole lot of money to be made there. But I think if you went over to Japan and saw the size of their comic book market, and then the other sales they do outside of that, there's a ton, and I do mean an absolutely metric fuck ton of money to be made in comic sales, especially in the book channel, via graphic novels, not just in North America, but really around the world. And for some reason, Marvel and DC haven't really figured that out. At least DC has figured out something to kind of go out and compete there. I assume the DC compact comics are also making a little bit of noise worldwide as people kind of prefer that format. But they are so dwarfed at this point, it's not even funny. Here's another example of that one. The top 750 best-selling graphic novels of 2022 paint a very grim picture for American publishers. Manga dominated the charts with titles like Chainsaw Man Volume 1 selling over 276,000 copies, Spy Family Volume 1 close behind at 271,000, and Demon Slayer Volume 1 at 264,000. These aren't one-off hits either. They're part of a massive wave. Manga took 458 of the top 750 top spots. Viz Media alone had 301 titles on the list. DC's highest ranking book was Sandman Book 1 at number 257 with just 59,000 units sold. Marvel's best, Moon Knight at 483 with a dismal 17,000 units. Even Miles Morales' Shockwaves, a Marvel character but published through Scholastic, only managed 42,000 units at number 204. Despite releasing over 5,000 new comics through bookstores, Marvel was almost entirely absent from the charts. The numbers truly do speak for themselves, that when Marvel and DC are looking for a hit and they're hoping something really pops off, they're thinking about the tens of thousands in North America as far as sales across all the bookstore channel. When manga is talking about or thinking about a massive hit or something doing well, they're thinking about the hundreds of thousands. They're basically playing a different sport at this point when they're thinking about sales and projecting what a top-selling manga is actually capable of doing in the North American market. And these numbers are like, I don't want to use the word terrifying. I don't want to be too hyperbolic, but they are kind of jaw-dropping when you think about what's performing and what's kind of competing there. And then you realize that Sandman Book 1, the reason that it even had 59,000 units sold was because there was a Netflix TV show. It wasn't like all of a sudden Sandman just became one of the hottest things in the world because of the comic book publishers. It wasn't anything DC did. It was something that an outside entity that DC clearly has no control over whatsoever was able to generate hype and interest in their own books. Feels like they have no say-so when it comes to the bookstore channel on what people are going to like or even be interested in at this point. Although in 2024, the introduction of these DC compact comics is making some noise. Thankfully, they finally have something competing, but you can see like the gap between the two is so enormous that it's not even funny. Although I do believe with a full year of sales, something like a Batman Hush or perhaps even the Killing Joke Watchmen will probably hit triple digits as well and be well inside like the top 100 selling books. Unfortunately, we will never be able to confirm that because Brian Hibbs and Comics Beat no longer have access to the MPD book scan or is it Circana book scan numbers at this point. But the Marvel stuff is really distressing. When you put out 5,000 separate titles, one of them makes the top 750 and it comes in with 17,000 sales. Nothing else even makes a blip or even shows up that you've published. You're doing something wrong. You're not making an impact in this market, and it is the most lucrative market in North America. And oh yeah, the one book that sold the most featuring a Marvel character is not from Marvel. They actually had to go out and license it to Scholastic just to even get sales. Marvel are in the absolute shits right now. And one of the things I certainly noticed in this deep dive, which I probably could have predicted, but has certainly been validated and confirmed is true, is the lack of new breakout titles from Marvel and DC are absolutely hurting them. Beyond raw sales, the bestseller turnover tells you who's growing and who's stuck in the past. In 2022, the manga charts were alive with new blood. Chainsaw Man, Kaiju number 8, and Spy Family all surged onto the scene alongside fan favorites like My Hero Academia. That constant flow of fresh titles keeps new readers coming in. Meanwhile, Marvel and DC are clinging to decades-old material. DC's top seller in 2022 were books like Sandman, Batman Year One, and Watchmen, all written before many of today's manga readers were even born. Marvel hasn't had a breakout hit in years. Their most successful title in 2021 was Infinity Gauntlet, published back in 1991, and even that didn't crack the top 750. Manga keeps evolving, and American comics keep reprinting the past. And I do think this is probably the most disheartening takeaway out of all of this is that while manga is constantly churning out fresh titles and new creators and new characters that are able to fill the needs of these readers once they've maybe gone through a One Punch Man or One Piece or My Hero Academia, Marvel and DC aren't doing that. It's the weirdest trend too, because for years, Marvel and DC have essentially been writing for the trades. They write their periodic comic books so they can be published successfully in the trade format. You get the one complete story that lasted, 4 to 6 or 8 issues or whatever. And it doesn't make an impact because none of the stories are really classic. Even the good stories that have come out as of late tend to not make much of an impact. Like you don't see Doomsday Clock on here for some reason. You see Batman 3 Jokers, but you see it for 1 year, essentially. And it's really strange that they are accommodating with a format that should serve this audience specifically, basically at the cost of the direct market that's selling periodic comic books, because they're formatting their periodics to fill bookstore shelves, and it does not translate whatsoever. And it's weird that they weren't able to capitalize on Infinity Gauntlet becoming a bigger seller, considering Infinity War and Endgame are essentially loosely based on Infinity Gauntlet. It certainly got some notoriety, but it never ended up being like a 6-digit seller, which it probably should have been because it was like the most popular thing in the world. I guess Marvel just forgot to tell people, hey, yeah, you like that movie? It's based on this thing that Jim Starlin did that was absolutely amazing and groundbreaking and certainly different, but it is a classic. And people aren't discovering any of the new titles from Marvel and DC. We know that new titles can make an impact because certainly the American comic book that was competing with manga, before these DC compact comics came online in 2024, was TMNT The Last Ronin. Major characters with a lot of lore and history telling a story that people wanted to read with really good creators on it. And for some reason, Marvel and DC aren't getting the message and they're not serving that audience. So people are just kind of going over to manga, and it just kind of tells this really bleak story. Now, the gap closed a little bit in 2023 because manga sales decreased, but it wasn't because Marvel DC sales increased. In fact, DC had its worst selling year, I think, since 2004, like 20 years. it got that bad. And Marvel was consistently pathetic even into 2023. But we do know that DC is doing better, at least. DC is just kind of doing everything better than Marvel these days. They're certainly not catching up to manga when it comes to unit sales or dollar sales, but they are pulling away from Marvel and getting into the conversation with these DC compact comics. But once again, the problem that we just talked about, manga has all this new, fresh blood that's constantly coming into the market, and then the anime hits and it gets popular again and it comes back into the market and people are discovering it, where Marvel and DC simply just don't have that. These DC compact comics are not new stories. They're not things that have been produced in the last 2 or 3 years. They're things that have been produced 30 years ago that continue to sell for the last 30 years and are now selling, in a smaller format that just so happens to fit into the manga scale and is doing very, very well. So they have got to come up with some classic stories if they want to be able to ever start competing with manga again. I don't think it'll happen within the next 5 years. I don't predict that it would be able to happen in the next 10 years. I don't think compact comics can make that kind of a difference. And if I'm being completely honest, I'm not confident that American comic books will be able to catch up when it comes to bookstore channel sales in my lifetime, which I assume is going to be another 35 to 40 years, because I do think they pulled ahead that much, and DC and Marvel have underserved and misread the market to that degree that I think they'll just stay out there, and there might be another boom of anime or maybe live action movies that actually push it even further ahead, because we've already gone through the superhero movie boom. I don't think we're ever going to get anything bigger than Endgame. And to some degree, it does feel like that bubble is kind of burst. Although we do have to get to Secret War. We have to get to Doomsday. We do have to get to this DCU started out by Superman. Maybe there's another 5 years or another decade left in American superhero movies, but there's also a pretty decent chance that that age is over as well, and they might never catch up. I'm not really sure. The picture is very bleak. I knew it was going to be bad. Obviously, you don't know exactly how bad it's going to be. I've been reporting on this essentially since my channel started, but I never went really back and looked at all the numbers comprehensively at all the same time. And it does not paint a pretty picture, especially in the bookstore channel. And Marvel and DC definitely have some work to do to catch up. Although, admittedly, DC's compact comics make an impact. If you appreciate this kind of awesome analysis that you will never find anywhere else on the YouTubes, just right here on Think Critical YouTube, and you would like to support the mission and be a part of the family, there's one place to do that at Think Critical Patreon. There's a link in the video description. There's a button right here. I do hope to see you there very, very soon.